This is Stephanie talking. This video was created not to denigrate any other point of view, any other way that people want to play. It is simply to give our own perspective on it, so it's an opportunity for people to see it from a different point of view. Although, of course, we're very much into the integration of the spiritual and the physical realms. We also are a group that is very logical and rational, because we understand that logic and rationality depends upon synchronicity, that things have to fit together. And you keep looking. If you find evidence that things don't fit into the particular point of view that you have, then you have to shift your point of view in order to get a bigger view. And sometimes you have to throw out what you thought you knew, because it just doesn't fit back together, and you realize you might have a misconception that is controlling your understanding of things. Our beliefs are the bars to our cages, and if we're going to fly free, it's like saying that we're open to all possibilities, but it doesn't mean we throw out logic. It doesn't mean we throw out the rational mind in favor of our own particular cage. So that's what this discussion is about. It is a candid discussion with the certain members of the Circle of Love. We like to discuss things and say things the way we feel like saying them, and not mince our words in order to protect other people's sensitivities, because if you're sensitive about it, it probably indicates that you're trying to protect some of your bars on your cages. And we like to be free with each other and talk in a way that is very frank. This discussion arose because I listened to someone who purported to be channeling people close to Jesus to tell the story, and it just didn't resonate with me based on logic and also upon my own connections, and so I decided to ask. I just listened to somebody again, all these people with their Jesus stories. What is all that about? There's so many Jesus stories. Steve stepped in to take on this question. Most people have so much trust on the story of Jesus as portrayed through the biblical accounts and the historically inaccurate reproductions of the stories perpetuated by certain individuals who saw some advantage in doing that. That is a profound filter through which they filter all information. They will filter all information through it in order to not have any incoherence or any dissonance with their prior belief structure. So they will have to filter something through their belief structure in a way that will allow them to stay trusting on their own beliefs. So it's a belief thing. So for them, there's little problem with this kind of thing, because it allows them to stay within a certain vibration that is comfortable to them. They would not resonate, for example, with what Jesus tells you, Steph, that he was the product of incest. They just can't resonate with that. nor can they resonate with the idea of Mother Mary being a human being, just like everybody else, just doing her best. They just can't fathom that, because if they were to trust upon that kind of information and their belief structures were threatened, they would feel as if the world were coming apart. They would feel as if the world were coming apart because they cannot trust on their true identity, that they are the fabricators of their own reality. They just can't say, hey, I just made this up today, in order to stay within a certain bandwidth. So they can't trust on flying free of their cages. They just have to believe in their own inherently unstable reality. It's unstable because it keeps coming back to them in a way that doesn't parlay with reality. In other words, here is a story about Jesus and his mother who worked through all these ages to perfect her ability to conceive immaculately. For what purpose? For what purpose would you do that? Who would do that? Why would you want to shortchange the normal process of reproduction? What do you have to gain? And I guess that's a good question. What do you have to gain? You have to gain the ability to retrain yourself and everybody else to adhere to the same bullshit that was fed to you when you were a child and through many, many lifetimes. So you come up with a story that fits the facts that in your mind, which are not facts, they're fallacies, but you come up with a story that fits the fallacies. And when you fly free, you just say, I don't know, fuck it, who cares? Because you know that it's all a fabrication. The difference for you and me and others here is that we trust upon God energy to make things very, very clear. He doesn't fiddle around with all these clowns who want to take you down because your story doesn't match their story. In our story, we're always looking for how things line up. And if they don't line up in a way that is coherent, consistent, and inherently sound, then we say, it doesn't sound right to me, doesn't sound right to me. Because when I talk to Jesus, it makes so much sense and it fills my heart with joy. Now, it may fill their heart with joy to feel like they have the ability to talk to Jesus and he will say, hey, it's all true, immaculate conception, yeah, I rose from the dead, da-da-da-da-da-da. And they say, cool, it all fits together in the story that was fed to me when I was 3. And so they are happy until something comes along to shake the foundation of their trust on their story. So when you are talking to me, you go and research everything I say. And you say, does this make sense? Does this make sense? Does this make sense? So if someone says to you, well, I spent many lifetimes learning how to do immaculate conception, then you would say, does that mean then that your children are all conceived without a father. Because if that's what you've been practicing that throughout the generations, right? And your mother too. And so the normal processes of biology do not apply to you. I'm not saying that it isn't possible, but I'm saying show us the evidence, show us the evidence, show us the proof. Show us how this fits together in the big puzzle, because it doesn't make sense to us. It doesn't make sense to us. Why didn't you continue this immaculate conception process through the next generations over the last 2,000 years? Or did you? Is half the population of the world immaculately conceived? And how come we're not noticing it? How come these virgins are not having babies? What's going on here? Why, if you had such a good handle on how to do this, didn't you keep doing it? Doesn't make any sense to us. And so we just have to say, not a shred of evidence to prove that this is true. Because evidence, you see, is synchronicity. It is the ability of everything you see to perpetuate a mind, over matter reality. Because the mind, of course, is the ability to conceive of reality. And it will then proceed to experience it as a physicality. And the heart is the connection to the God energy. And so you might say that you got to have both sides of it. So where's the proof? Where's the beef? Where's the meat in this story? I don't get it. But if she wants to come and explain how she researched it and figured it out and used logic and here's how it fits into the bigger picture, then that might help us to get a different point of view. But if she's just trying to claim a point of view that will do for all of the ones who trust that God, Jesus was the only Son of God, then this makes no sense at all. No sense at all. Makes no sense to me and anyone I see here in the circle of love. Okay, maybe we need to get Jesus in so we can adjust that. But we've already talked to Jesus, and of course, his story is that he was born from incest, to that Mary was a girl who was subjected to sexual advances from her own father, and that I guess the renowned, whatever his name is, who is a saint in the, I just looked it up, he was a saint or considered a saint or something. Is that the one who raped her? Steve speaking. Yes. There was a lot of that in that day and age, Steph, a lot of it. Because it was the trust on outward appearances that was important. It was just the trust on outward appearances. And a lot of sexual misuse went on, as you know, from some of your own past lives. The priests were notorious in the Catholic Church for raping young girls, and it was just accepted that that was the way it was, but nobody would talk about it, of course, because the church had, your thumbs in a thumbscrew, and you couldn't really challenge them unless you wanted to get the rack. So They got away with a lot. Right up into the current age, they got away with a lot, didn't they? They treated you pretty poorly, didn't they? They certainly did, Steve. You know, it's very, very hard to take, those nuns, what they did to me. Some of them were nice. I'm not going to say they were all bad. I don't want to categorize them as good or bad. It was a good lesson for me, though, that Catholicism is the cover of a book that includes many, many harsh realities. Anyway, so I don't know if she just wants to talk about it or not, but another thing that comes up is everybody are these people. So you've had past lives as many illustrious people. I've had a lot of slave lives, but I've been connected to a lot of illustrious people because I'm connected to you and Thomas, and you and Thomas have a strong energy, and Tobias and others that were part of the Elohim. But we're an extremely logical group, as I see it, and we tend to look at things in the big picture. We keep trying to pick things apart and find out how they fit together. So there's a trust in our group that everything does fit together. That it, as I say, and you guys say as well, love is the core reality, and in order to know itself, love had to split into the lover and the beloved in everything. So duality was created in order for that which was singular to know each other. And even then, God is not singular, because there's always possibility of a bigger God, or if God is everything, what is nothing? The potential, right? And it's the same thing. Nothing and everything is essentially the same thing. Okay, so those are things that we take for granted, and I take for granted. I didn't at one time, but I take it for granted now that I have, in my lifetime, had many experiences that broke through the clouds, you might say. Clouds separated and I saw the sun, so to speak. And so I now take for granted that the answer is there is no answer. There's no answer to why we exist. Love exists, period. That's it. And it is constantly replicating itself through this movement. As you explained to me in the book that we're working on now, Gatekeepers, that emotion is what gives life. And life does not give emotion. Emotion gives life, because emotion is the movement of energy, which is necessary for there to be this experience of life. Otherwise, it would just be, as you say, asleep. God energy would be asleep. It would just be the deep sleep. So we have this energy that's in motion, and so there's a tendency in our group to be logical and impersonal, in a way. To be both personal and impersonal, to see both sides of that, because everything's a duality. And therefore, to use both sides of the brain, intuition and logic, and to proceed from there. And so what I see from what you just explained is that a lot of people have a sort of parochial view, more parochial view, that doesn't go back that deep into the nature of reality. So for instance, they have a story about Jesus being the only Son of God, and therefore God has only one son, and God can have a son, but the rest of us are not sons and daughters of God, or whatever it is. It doesn't make sense to me, which is why I rejected it, because it just leads to hypocrisy. It leads to, there's no inherent consistency in the stories. And it's clear that it's just, the consistency lies in the fact that it's used to control people. The consistency lies in the fact that there is a certain point of view that is used to control people. And so religion is one of those very powerful means of control. How it came to be, the intricacies of it, we've covered that through many books, and I understand through many conversations how all of us are implicated in it. However, it's just there. And every day we're just here. Every day, everywhere, we're just here, wherever we are. But some people have a sort of box, I guess you'd call it a cage, a belief structure, in which everything has to fit. Because if you pulled a brick out of their wall, the whole wall might collapse, and then they collapse with it because they trust upon their belief structure to keep them safe. And they can't just stand there. I mean, I know that in the last 8 years, I've had to stand still many times until I could get my bearing, take a step into the unknown, and I couldn't see anything from there. I just have to stand there until things began to appear, and then I could see where I was many times. And so you just have to accept that this is the way it is. That if you want to explore the unknown, it's going to be unknown. So when I listen to this, it's like, yes, kind of coerced effort to channel something that would fit into the story of Jesus being the only Son of God and immaculate conception and all that. So it's kind of forced to me, is the way it sounds. And I can say it logically does not make sense to me. It just doesn't make sense to me logically. Could there be immaculate conception? I'm going to say it's possible because I think everything is possible. But, show us how this is done. Show us these virgins who we can medically check and make sure they're still virgins and they're pregnant. I'm not seeing it. So where's the evidence? Anyway, what I want to say, too, is this idea that everyone, another thing was that she said that Mary had a sister that conceived immaculately also. So why isn't that person as revered as Jesus if it's the Son of God? So that means there's two sons of God? I don't get it. Anyway, and then what about their children, if they had children? Can they have children? And if they can have children, does that mean that they're partially the children of God? Very confusing. But maybe all this immaculate conception business, does that go back to the Elohim? And the story of the Elohim, does that coincide there? Steve speaking. The trust on the DNA from the Elohim is the trust on conception through copulation with the gods. So it's a variation, you might say. It's a variation on it. Okay, so I get that. So what about, I know you've explained this to me before, but I don't think we've ever explained it to others. What about this idea that people, 60 people can claim to be Marilyn Monroe or whatever, or Cleopatra? I've never heard anybody say to me that I believe I was Cleopatra. Never heard anybody say to me that I believe I was Marilyn Monroe. And as you know, we do many, many sessions with people where we explain to them about their past lives. And sometimes they've been famous. And if they are, we are able to tell them about that lifetime in pretty intense detail. They're able to research information we provide them. They're able to look it up or in other connections they have to validate it. So there's a lot of validation that goes on in the information we've provided people from the Akashic records or whatever about their past lives. And sometimes they've had past lives that were in a relationship of some kind with those in the circle. And we just keep getting validation after validation after validation on this because it all synchronizes. It synchronizes. It's amazing how when you start looking for the evidence, it all fits together. So that makes sense to me. And those people who hypnotize people to do past life regressions, like there's that one guy who then researches to find information, that makes sense to me. Because he's looking for the evidence to support what's coming through. And it synchronizes for these people. It makes sense to them. So that I can understand. But for all these people to say, well, I was this famous person or whatever. Some people do have to have been that person, but you've explained this to me before. Could you explain it again? I would love to explain it again, Steph, because the more people understand this, the better. There are many, many stories that reflect the path of the soul energy as it goes through eternity. So these are stories, and these stories accumulate, and they accumulate and can be read through access to the Akashic records. Most people understand that nothing in the universe is lost, nothing that has occurred will disappear. It will exist always in some stratosphere, you could say, of the universal matrix, and it can be accessed. And so that's why we say you can't change the past, you can only transform the present. So you can find out who actually inhabited that physical form in that story. And then you can say, well, in the story that we're in, which is only one story of the infinite variety of stories that could occur, I'm not saying they all have, because there's the potential that could occur throughout eternity, which of course you know eternity is not time-based, it's just eternity. There's no other way to explain it than it's eternity. So we live on the planet Earth, which has a history. That is the story of those people who are listening to this now. It is the story that is applicable to you, to me, to everybody in the circle here. We are human beings because we have the physical experience of being humans again and again and again in the earth vibration. This is a powerful story of God energy being experienced through the matrix of reality. That is to say, the best way I can describe it is to say through the experience of physicality, of having a particular point of view from a particular part of reality upon the rest of reality. And so, as a human being, you will continue to have many points of view. Even in your own lifetime, you will have many points of view. You will be a child, you will be a parent, a grandparent, a business person, or a worker in a grocery store, whatever it is, you will have many different POVs in your own lifetime. And then you will have so many diverse points of view from your many lifetimes. Some lifetimes, many of them in fact, throughout history, there would be little change from parent to child in terms of the way their life is lived. But in current times, that is in the last centuries, or last couple thousand years, things have changed a great deal. They have also changed a great deal at other times in history. It's like the waves, it comes and goes. Now, if you remember having had a lifetime as, say, Marilyn Monroe, it might be because you did have a lifetime as Marilyn Monroe, and all we have to do is go to the Akashic records and we can check it out for you. However, it also could be that you knew Marilyn Monroe in her lifetime, so you have a memory of Marilyn Monroe, and you say, oh, that must have been me. But you only knew her, or you may have known of her, or you may have had a particular desire to have experienced life from her point of view. And so there could be lots of reasons that people come to believe that they are a particular person, because the imagination is very, very, very powerful. Understanding the interplay of the imagination with reality is something we're not going to get into in depth here, other than to say that the imagination can create your reality. Of course it can. And so your reality will now be that you believe you were Marilyn Monroe. It doesn't mean you were Marilyn Monroe. It believes that you were Marilyn Monroe, and that becomes part of your reality. And if you're not careful, you can become so lost in your story that it all just starts to crack like a rotten egg and spill its contents in smelly goo. So what you do, Steph, when we tell you something is you go research it. And you say, does this make sense? Is it synchronized with other stuff? And the more we talk, if you find something that doesn't resonate with you, you say, what about this? Just as you're doing now. Because at one time you couldn't figure out why people were saying these things. So you came to me to ask, or to someone in the circle, and we told you exactly what I'm telling you now. That many people can claim to have been someone, even because they heard a story about someone or watched a movie or whatever. It will get into their soul matrix, and they will interpret the reality of what they experienced. And the reality of what they experienced is they might have been her friend or just someone who was a fan or whatever, and it got into their soul matrix as an experience. And then they interpreted the experience in such a way to say, I was Marilyn Monroe. But there was only one person who was Marilyn Monroe. Only one person. One soul energy in all of the history of mankind was Marilyn Monroe. There is another facet of this, which we've gone over before, and which you explained to someone very well. You said, imagine a plant that is growing, a house plant, and you take cuttings off it and you put them in water until they sprout roots, and then you plant them and they grow. So if a particular soul energy, and this is more applicable to people outside of our group because we don't do this regularly, only occasionally when it's really necessary. If you were Marilyn Monroe, for example, and I'm not saying this is true of Marilyn Monroe, or use her for example, but we could easily use anybody else. If you were this individual and you were the main plant that had grown up in this pot in the sunshine, and then the cuttings of this plant were made and the cuttings were planted into another pot and they were taken to somebody else's home or put in a different location or whatever, they would still retain some of the memory of the original plant that grew out of a seed, you see? And even the seed itself can have some memory. This is akin to the division of the soul energy. So that if you divide the soul energy, it's like making lots of cuttings that you then plant that become new plants, and they all derive from that one plant. And this can go on and on and on. And that's why there can be such a vast population today that outstrips the populations of the past, because of this consistent redistribution of the energy of the soul of the primary source of that energy. Now you have to understand that the more the soul energy is divided, the more complicated it can become in terms of individual memory and inherited memory in your soul history. because the story of the souls goes back to the time of the Anunnaki, when the souls from the Martians who were incarnated into the bodies of the Elohim divided their own energy in such a way to help the fledgling humans to be able to grow and thrive under the iron fist of the Anunnaki. And the Elohim did that because they anticipated that eventually the Anunnaki would leave, and in the meantime the humans that were being created were suffering because they could not understand the demands placed upon them, and they were being punished unnecessarily because they didn't have the soul memories that would allow them to understand the Anunnaki. And of course we could understand the Anunnaki pretty well because we all started on Nibiru. And so we divided our energy and gave some of it to the new humans, who then had an easier go of it because they could communicate in a more productive way. And they became the kernels of the soul energy today. So not only do we have a massive population that is trusting on cages that they have to stay in because they were told that they have to stay in those cages by their parents, and they didn't know any better because they were very like the parents in that they inherited the parents' memories. And so we have a very watered down soul energy in the world today that cannot think for itself because the cages of its belief structures go back through many, many generations. The Elohim, as we have said before, did not share their energy in the same way that the other humans did, except at the beginning when they had to help them get a start. And so many people could claim to be Marilyn Monroe, or probably better said, somebody who lived longer ago, because of the splitting of the soul energy and the retention of some of those memories. However, their memories are going to be attenuated. They're going to be very, very attenuated. This does not stop them from getting a little piece of evidence and misconstruing it, because this happens all the time. That's why when we talk to you, we know that you are going to check everything out and make sure that it makes sense, that it fits together, and if it doesn't, you'll come back with questions. And if you can't find it in Wikipedia or some other source that you use, or you don't have sufficient experience to say it's true, then you will say, I can't accept this. I can't accept this. Then we'll have to try to explain to you what happened. For example, we had to explain to you when someone came to you when he was confusing two lifetimes that happened back to back, both in the same area. And he got confused, and he was talking about one childhood and another adulthood. And you said, well, I looked it up and the adulthood matches your name that you gave me, but the childhood circumstances do not match that name. And then he had to explain, after he went back and checked it out, he actually had to go back and look at the Akashic records to make sure he had it right. And he came back and said, oh, I had another lifetime. And I was confused because when you're here, you are trying to remember a particular movie and the incidences of it when you've got a couple thousand movies on your shelves that you haven't watched yet, or that you have watched previously but you haven't watched recently. And so if two of the movies were similar, you might mix them up because your memory is limited. You see, can only hold so much information at one time. And that's true of us here as it's true of you. There. You can only contain so much memory before it starts to lose its vibrancy and it becomes more and more faded until it fades away. It's just the way it is. It's just the limitations on memory. But you can always go back to the Akashic records and check it out. You can always check out that movie again of that lifetime when you're here, and you can watch the movie. And you can say, oh yeah, I remember now. I remember this movie. I haven't seen it in the last 20 lifetimes, but I remember it now. And that made sense to you because that was logical. And so, although you couldn't verify that on your own experience at this point in your life, you said, okay, that makes sense, so I'm going to trust that is true unless I receive some evidence that says it's not true. If I receive evidence that says it's not true, then I'll have to explore it and get an explanation. So as for example, when you listen to these people supposedly channeling Jesus or Mary, Mother Mary, or someone else, that you will say, well, this makes no sense to me because it doesn't comport with the other information that I have here, so I better check it out. You don't just say, well, this can't be true. You say, let me check it out. Let me research it. So you are not what we would call gullible. You might be gullible in some circumstances, and that's okay, because you just laugh and say, hey, that was fun today to be so gullible, and now I'll just go think about it a bit, and then I'll say, hey, I hope you guys had a good laugh because I was so gullible, but now we better get it straight because I don't want to mislead anyone. So if you're playing a joke on me, you better get clear. We say, okay, we better get clear with our dear because we value our connection to you. And sometimes we joke around here, but we are not fooled by the little pranks we pull on each other because we can see under the covers, so to speak. Whereas there, it's a little bit harder sometimes to tell, and you have to rely on your sense of smell. Does it smell right or not? And if it doesn't smell right, then you better check it out. So that is how we know what we know. We just know what we know because it fits together in a way that makes us say, hey, this feels right, smells right, feels good to us. And if something comes along that doesn't smell good to us, we better check it out because that means it's testing our credulity and it's testing our ability to find the underlying pattern. The underlying pattern is the pattern that sustains us all. It sustains reality. And if we can't find the pattern, then we need to get more evidence, which is what we do in the physical realm. We get evidence that helps us to discern the patterns, the non-physical patterns that govern fast physicality. And that is the way we do it in our group. Thank you. Okay, so Steve, or Jesus, if he wants to step in and talk about it. Um, Supposedly, his parents were Mary and Joachim, or not Mary, I'm sorry, Anna and Joachim, and they were, saintly people, rich and infertile and da 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 da, until the angel came to them, and Mary's consecrated and not raised like other girls, and da 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 da. What's the truth of all this that you know? Jesus says, I'll step in here, Steph, and talk about this because I'm okay with it. I'm okay talking to you about it. And I know others cannot accept this because they have been spoon-fed so much bullshit all their lives that they can't tell their belly button from their what? From their aging myself here. When I say this, they can't tell their belly button from their backwards looking access to the stew they accessed when they were told the story of the virgin birth, because their belly button is the access to reality, you see? And they don't know what it's for, because this whole idea of immaculate conception makes no sense at all. If you're going to be immaculately conceived, why would you go through the bother of the whole pregnancy and birth process? Just stand up and be counted. It's a illogical attempt to understand the origins of humanity, because there is so much dark energy around the origins of humanity. How did it begin? Where did people come from? In days gone by, people did not understand the origins of humanity as a process of evolution. They just saw man as being set down on the earth in order to play their hand and to live as representations of God energy in the animal kingdom. They didn't know how it happened. Did God just say, hey, here's Adam and Eve that I did conceive in my little laboratory in the sky, and now they're going to populate the world? What happened back then? And of course, the story of the Anunnaki is deeply embedded in the human memory, because even though people may not know that story, they have access within their DNA to the ancient feelings that arose and that became embedded in the access to their inheritance from their parents, because your DNA carries with it your entire history from the creative impulse that put it in play. And the creative impulse here is a combination of the ape physiology, which is the result of a long process of individuation of God energy, and the insertion of the Anunnaki DNA. And so they have this image deep in their soul energy of a process of immaculate conception, where it is not necessary to have a sexual relationship with someone in order to conceive a child. Today, you have in vitro fertilization that might be similar to that old sense of intervention from the gods in the biological processes that created mankind. And so because they had this impression of the Anunnaki as the creators of humanity, they've been confused for 300,000 years nearly. And they just change the story a little bit here and there, and then they always come back to the same basic idea of this intervention in the biological sphere from the Anunnaki that created the story of the creator gods, which eventually was rendered in many religions as a singular titular God head that created mankind. So the confusion in the human story is very old and very deeply ingrained. And so when Mary became impregnated by her own father, it was not acceptable, of course, even in that time. Certainly in that time, incest was not accepted, because the prohibition against incest had a long standing, as you know, in order to break up the Elohim DNA so that it could be spread through the rest of humanity and not kept as a trust on continuing the division between the capabilities of the Elohim and the more limited scope of the biology of the other humans, at least as they considered it, because they were not as adept in either their flexibility of thinking or their flexibility of form. And so when Mary became impregnated, there had to be a story to explain it. And at the time, it was covered up by the marriage of Mary to Joseph, who agreed to this arrangement because he was interested in having a young wife like Mary who would provide many children for him. And he, at that time, was not a particularly appealing bridegroom for most people. He did not have money or goods, so he was not a wealthy man, and the idea that he is a wealthy man is laughable. It's truly laughable. So he actually had other children through his wives, because he actually had more than one. And Mary's mother was unaware of the incest going on in the family until Mary became pregnant, which at that time was signaled by the interruption of the menstrual cycle. Even young girls understood that that meant that they were pregnant. And so when this became known to Mary's mother, it created quite a to-do. Let me tell you, it created quite a to-do, and she had to figure out what to do to save her daughter. And so she gave her to Joseph as a wife. Well, of course the father did, but it was really the instigation of the mother to save the reputation of her daughter. And she became betrothed to Joseph, and they were married, and they actually took up residence in a different community in order to maintain the trust on others, not condemning Mary for being a loose woman and not perceiving the truth, which was that Joachim was the father of her child, which of course was a scandal in that day, just as it would be today, although it was regularly covered up and it happened fairly often. But the women and the young girls like Mary were the ones who had to take the brunt of the actions of the male half of the population, because that's the way it was in those days, just as it has been up until the current time. Steph speaking. And by the way, just so people know, I've encountered you in other lifetimes as well. I mean, not necessarily encountered you since I started working with the circle. You've come to me most often in a different identity. And I also apparently had a lifetime with you, maybe more than one, I don't know, but one particularly in the Middle Ages in France, when I had a brief encounter with you in a different identity, correct? Jesus speaking. Caveman mentality. Caveman mentality is the inability to understand this stuff, because they cannot comprehend of the nature of the soul and the life of the children of the light. They are very limited in their ability to see reality. And that is why it's difficult for people to understand this story, because they have been fed the story of the glory of my birth and of everybody in my lineage in order to create the impression that there was something extraordinary about me. And it served a purpose for the people who were trying to create a myth in order to fool the people with the trust on being controlled. Because if you're going to be controlled, there has to be something to control you with. And what can you control people with? You can control them with the idea that if they do what you tell them to, then you will be trusting on a future life free of anxiety. So you go to heaven, you'll be happy there. And in order to create this impression, they have to give you a pathway to get there. And the pathway they gave them was to see me in such a false reality that it hardly bears any resemblance to the facts at all. And it's pretty obvious that it's just all a bunch of bullshit. But people have been eating that bullshit for a long time, because if they didn't swallow it, then they would be punished, you see. Then they would be punished very, very brutally. And you know that is so, because you had many lifetimes where you were under the thumb of the Roman Catholic Church or some other version of hypocrisy that would attempt to save the body and kill the soul. Because, of course, that's the opposite of reality. You can't kill the soul, but you can become so confused. You can think you are the body and that you have to live forever, and the soul is just something you sold down the river. You just sold it down the river when you said, hey, I read that Jesus will come again and save us all from perdition if we just do what we're told and gather the gold and give it to the ones who will use it to keep us enslaved to their trust on being a body and not a soul. Because if these people really thought that they were an eternal soul, do you think they'd be behaving the way they are? Hardly. They don't trust on that. The ones who do, and there are some who penetrate to the truth, are generally silenced so they can't confuse the ones who are clueless as to the truth. So I'm being pretty blunt here, which is why I like to talk to you, because I can be blunt and you don't bat an eye, because you just say, tell me true what you know, and I will see if it makes sense to me. And so far it makes sense to you, right? Makes perfect sense to me, Jesus. It makes perfect sense to me. And so it makes sense to you because you always knew that the bullshit they were feeding you through the auspices of the Catholic Church were ridiculous. It was just ridiculous. How could anybody even believe that? It just defied logic. And yet you also believed in me. You believed that I had a history and a life that I did live. You trusted on that. You knew it was true, and of course you knew it was true because you were there too. And you knew me in that lifetime. So you always trusted upon the fact that you knew me, you knew the story, you knew the true story, and you weren't going to buy all that bullshit, even though you didn't know all the details, or I should say you couldn't remember all the details, because you did know the details once upon a time, because you were someone who had a fine mind even in that lifetime, and who had known me since I was a child. So you understood that Everything they were telling you was just to get you to relinquish the truth and buy into their false reality so they could live in the illusion that they had power that would free them from the need to accept reality, that they were eternal beings and that they were fouling their own nest, because that's what they were doing. They didn't want to know that. They don't really believe they're eternal beings. It just defies the logic to think so from the way that they explain it. It's just not logical, and even they could not believe their own bullshit. But they could play the game, and they played it very well and took what they could and would resell it back to you in attempt to get you to buy your own soul back from them, that they would grab and put it in hell, and then you'd have to ransom it. So of course they knew very well the wiles of the devil, because they were the devils, you see. And I'm not standing here in order to condemn them or anyone. I'm just telling you the way it was. And you understand this, that it's not that small children or people that are immature in their ability to understand reality are to be condemned or to be hated. They're just incapable of adapting to a different reality than the one that they have believed through the ages, because it will take a lot for them to understand their own history so they can change it. Like you say, they have to know where they are before they can make a choice where they want to go. Because they don't know where they are, because they don't know their own history, they are lost, you see. They're just lost. And that doesn't mean we need to stand by and say, it's okay if you are lost, you see. We can just point it out to them, and maybe a few will say, you're right. It's never made sense to me. I can see that I was very, very lost. And now you're giving me some information that may help me to find out what's really going on. And then I can change my song as I go along through the remainder of my life. I can put the pieces together, because I'll find other pieces and I'll adapt them into a new view of reality, and I'll keep picking away at it until I feel comfortable that it all makes sense, because it really needs to make sense. If it doesn't make sense, then it doesn't belong in your view of reality. It has to make sense. If it doesn't make sense, just put it aside until you can figure it out. Just put it aside and keep looking at the pieces until you can see how they fit together. And then you will refeather your nest in a way that will not be so full of sharp glass. And it'll be a lot more comfortable for you, because that sharp glass that comes to you when you know what they've taught you is not true will make you black and blue. And wouldn't you rather be comfortable in your own skin? Steph speaking. All right, so I have a question. So if the people who are hearing you talk, or supposedly knowing the story, the channel's supposed, who all, engage in the flower language and the Jesus is the only Son of God, Mary was a virgin bullshit. As I see it as bullshit. And they don't. So that's their filter. They have been imbued with the story for so long that they have to hear something that fits it. So what's my filter? Steve says, Steph, the only filter you have is the trust on reality. You just tell me, Steve, tell me your story. And I tell you my story, and you say, well, that's a good story, Steve. And let's see if it fits with all the other stories. Because it all has to fit together. It all has to fit together because it started out as a singularity and it unfolded from there. And therefore, it all has to fit back together into that singularity, right? I think so, Steve. So, you don't really have an agenda because you trust on the singularity that we know as God energy. You just trust on it, that it begins and ends in a trust on being inherently stable and inherently consistent and inherently insistent that everything be balanced, that everything that is created can be reduced down to the same simplicity of the lover and the beloved. If it can be reduced down to the simplicity that gave rise to its emergence from the God energy that you know as love, then the 2 points of view, the lover and the beloved, are the redemption of the original split that gave rise to the ability of God to know himself. And so you trust on that. That's your core belief, and that's your filter. Your filter is that everything has to fit back together in a way that makes sense, because the reason it makes sense is because the sense of it all is that it is a trust on being consistent. It's a trust on being consistent. It's a trust on being persistent in its ability to retain its inherent identity of God energy in the matrix of reality. And therefore, it has to be true to the duality that gave it birth, correct? Yes, Steve, that's the way I see it. So, within that context, you just listen to what we say and you say, well, I have to figure out how this fits together with all the other pieces. Because it all has to fit together. The puzzle has to fit together. The pieces have to fit in the big picture. The access to reality has to be an unfolding and a folding along the same lines. Everything has to go back into its proper place. And so, because your filter is so simple and true, it means that you can access whatever we tell you without any problem. Because you just say, oh, that's nice. Now let me figure it out if I can trust on it. Because if it's true, it's true. And there's nothing I can do about it. It's not up to me to say Hey, you can't say that. Hey, that won't fly. Hey, other people are going to cry if I say that. Because if other people cry when you say it, it means that the fact that they cry when you say it has to be part of reality. There has to be a beginning to the story of why they cry. So you go looking for the deeper principle that would explain it. And of course, we do that here in order to figure it out as well, because we also trust on the same filter as you do. We also trust on the fact that God is always true to God energy, and that it's persistent and insistent on its inherent identity. Well, then, so do other people there in heaven's side, other personalities or soul energies, ideas, minds, histories, whatever you want to call it, individuals. Do they have filters as well by which they interpret their own reality? Steve says, yes, of course they do. They come here laden with their own preconceptions, and then they have to fit it all into their ongoing story. So, for example, your mother, who came here still trusting upon the fact that she was a good woman and that she was correct in the way she treated you because of her long history of being a trust on Christianity. And so she had to come to see a different reality. But she only came to see it, Stephanie, because of this connection. Otherwise, she would have gone through her entire heavenside experience in that particular group of people who trusted on the same belief structure as she did. And there wouldn't be much flexibility in their thinking. And then when they go back to Earth, they will have to deal with their own belief structure as it comes up and as they are retrained into the same system or a different system, and it may cause some complexities in their life experience that they'll have to sort out. However, while they're here, they do indeed have filters by which they interpret their reality. So, Steve, if people there and people here have limitations on their ability, their flexibility of thinking, and they have these big filters that filter out anything that doesn't conform to what they already will accept, then what do they connect with each other from here to there and it contributes, or how does that work? Odd you should ask that, Steph, because I was talking to someone the other day here, and he said he was talking to his dear on earth, and she wanted to know if he had met Jesus. And he said, well, not exactly. I got the cardboard version, where you come here and you see cardboard version of Jesus that will talk to you as if it is the real Jesus. And you say, hi, how are you? And Jesus says, I love you too. And you say, well, I don't really believe you're really Jesus. And the cardboard figure says, I love you too. And how do you do? Because that's the way it's programmed. It's programmed to give you the impression and that it is the immaculate conception in the minds of the believers. And they say, well, it's Jesus, I love you, and Jesus says, I love you too. And they're happy because they got what they wanted. So he said to me, well, I was trying to explain to my loved one on earth that Jesus has his own story, but there's a version for everybody because they're created here. Because people say, well, when someone comes to heaven, they're going to expect to meet Jesus. So let's arrange it so that they can say hi, Jesus, and Jesus can say hi to them, and then they'll feel good about their experience in heaven. So there's still this duplicity that goes on, but people on earth don't understand it, and people here think of it as a way to help their loved ones on earth because that's what they expect to see and that's what they want to see, and it helps them to be more happy. And they go back to earth. They'll say, wow, I saw Jesus, so now I'm happy. Or whoever it is they want to see. Because the reality is that when you're here in heaven, you get to have whatever you want to have. Because your desires become your reality. Well, if your desires become your reality, does that mean somebody has to play that part? Yes, because even though your desires become your reality, there still has to be a mechanism for it to happen. So there still has to be a trust on the people that will help you meet your desires. And they say, well, this person has these desires, and we want to help them achieve their desires. So they'll be happy. And the more open a person is, the more a person says, well, I'm going to heaven, but I have no idea what I'm going to find there. I don't even know if there is a heaven or if it's a hell. Guess time will tell. And they come to heaven or hear of a near-death experience, they may have a very different experience because they're not trusting on meeting some figure that will tell them that everything they believe is true. They just say, hey, what's true, God? And God will say to them, well, let me take you on a tour, honey. Let me take you on a tour. And they say, cool. And they come back with a completely different point of view. And they won't necessarily say, well, I found out Jesus is real. They might say, I got to see the underpinnings of how our reality is created. And they might not care about the way others wear their hair because they now understand that things can't get out of hand. They can't get out of hand because there's an inherent reality that keeps everything in check and makes sure everything is balanced and nobody gets lost and nobody is required to pay the cost of their sins because the way the wheel spins is just the way the wheel spins. And they begin to grow through their inquisitive attitudes. They begin to say, well, I see things a little differently now. And others may come back, say, from a near-death experience and say, well, I met Jesus today, So I guess I'm okay. And that's all they care about. And others may come back and say, well, I got a tour of the underpinnings of reality, and now I see I was pretty fucked up in the way that I saw things. However, I understand that it's not all that complicated because the rules are simple and they govern the realms of the trust on life, you see. And so I don't have to worry anymore. And I don't have to be afraid of dying. I don't have to cry. And here's why. Because I found out it's all in good hands. It's all in good hands. And they will have a very different mentality from the ones who just needed to be reassured that Jesus was there to receive them and they could expect to spend eternity at his feet, you see? So it will differ for each individual. However, the more they redeem their energy on a fearless view of reality, the more they will feel safe in whatever milieu they find themselves in. And if they come face to face with Jesus, they'll say, hey, are you the real Jesus, or are you just here to make me feel good? And then the real Jesus will come to them and talk to them because he'll say, hey, I'm the real Jesus, and I'm not the one that has been spun into such a story that it has become the most gory story in all of history. And then he'll be able to relax and say, thank you for your trust on me today.